Hello people, let's go look new video.
How do I stay consistent in building a business? The hardest part wasn't coming up with the idea. It wasn't even taking the first step. The hardest part was sticking with it. I had always dreamed of owning my own business, of being in control of my time, my goals, and my future. But once I actually started my business, the honeymoon phase wore off quickly. In the beginning, it was all excitement. I spent days coming up with the perfect business plan, late nights writing up a marketing strategy, and hours setting up my website. There was something incredibly motivating about seeing all my hard work take shape. I remember feeling a rush every time I clicked publish on a new page or sent out an email to potential customers. It felt like I was creating something important. But as the weeks passed, the adrenaline began to wear thin. Some days, I woke up and felt like I was on top of the world, ready to tackle everything head-on. But other days, the weight of uncertainty felt overwhelming. The progress was slower than expected. Clients weren't flocking in, and profits were a distant dream. At first, I was motivated by the idea of what my business could become. But soon, the lack of immediate success started to make me question everything. How do I keep going when it feels like nothing is working? How do I stay consistent when every day feels like a struggle? I quickly learned that starting a business isn't the hard part. The hardest part is staying consistent when you're not seeing the results you expect. The first few months, the honeymoon phase. In the early days, I didn't realize how much of the journey was going to be about persistence. It wasn't long before the early excitement began to fade. Those first few months, when everything was shiny and new, had been full of hope. I told myself I'd work through any challenges, face setbacks head-on, and keep pushing forward, no matter what. But then came the late nights, when I wasn't seeing the kind of return I'd hoped for. The long, empty hours spent at my desk felt like they weren't leading to anything tangible. I began doubting myself. It was frustrating. I started comparing my business to others, bigger businesses, more successful entrepreneurs, and I began to wonder, what am I missing? Why aren't I making it? I remember one particular day when I looked at my bank account. There was still so much I needed to do, so many bills to pay, and I felt like my dream was slipping away. That day, I thought, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. I'd had a few wins here and there, small clients, positive feedback, but nothing like the breakthrough I had imagined when I first started. Facing the hard truth, consistency is key. I hit a turning point a few months in when I realized that motivation alone wasn't enough to keep me going. I used to believe that motivation was the driving force behind success. I thought if I just pushed through enough, something would finally click. But I soon realized motivation fades. There are days when motivation is nowhere to be found. When you don't feel like working, when the obstacles seem insurmountable, when you start wondering if it's all worth it. That's when consistency becomes the true lifeline. I had to get real with myself. If I wanted my business to succeed, I couldn't rely on motivation to carry me through. I needed a routine. So I began developing systems and habits that would keep me on track, even when I wasn't feeling motivated. I set a schedule. Marketing Monday, I would spend the day focusing solely on social media and emails. Sales Tuesday, I'd work on reaching out to potential clients, crafting proposals, and following up. Operations Wednesday, I dedicated this day to improving my products and services. Networking Thursday, I'd try to connect with other business owners, attend virtual events, and build relationships. Finance Friday, every Friday, I reviewed my expenses, profits, and business metrics to keep track of my financial goals. The consistency of having these routines gave me a structure. And in that structure, I found a sense of control. Even on days when things felt bleak, having a system made me feel like I was moving forward, no matter how small the steps were. The importance of discipline over motivation. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was that discipline beats motivation every time. There would be days when I had zero energy and no inspiration. The idea of working on my business felt like a chore, and I wanted to quit. But instead of focusing on my lack of motivation, I reminded myself that success in business isn't about waiting for the perfect mood to strike. It's about showing up, even when you don't want to. On those days, discipline became my saving grace. I told myself that if I just showed up and did the work, even if it was imperfect, I'd be one step closer to my goal. And it worked. The more I disciplined myself to push through the resistance, the easier it became to work through the low points. Even when things weren't going as planned, I would remind myself that every action, no matter how small, was adding up over time. Building resilience, learning from setbacks. As the months went on, I encountered more failures and obstacles. There were moments when the future seemed uncertain, and every setback made it harder to stay focused. At one point, a client I had been working with for months backed out last minute, leaving me feeling devastated. I had invested so much time and energy into that project, and losing it felt like a punch in the gut. It was the kind of disappointment that made me want to throw in the towel. I had spent so much time convincing myself that success was just around the corner, only to be hit by another roadblock. It felt like the universe was conspiring against me. But I had learned by then that setbacks weren't the end of the road. They were just part of the journey. I took a step back and decided to process the situation. I allowed myself to feel frustrated, but I didn't dwell on it. Instead, I asked myself, what can I learn from this? I analyzed everything about that lost project. What could I have done differently? How could I have communicated better? What steps could I take to avoid similar situations in the future? By focusing on the lesson rather than the loss, I was able to move forward. I learned to see each failure as an opportunity for growth, and that mindset shift made all the difference. The power of accountability. Staying consistent is hard when you're working alone. There are no team meetings to keep you accountable, no boss breathing down your neck, and no coworkers to check in with. At times, the isolation of running my business made it even harder to stay on track. That's when I realized I needed to surround myself with people who understood the journey. I started joining online business groups, attending networking events, and connecting with other entrepreneurs. Slowly, I built a support system of like-minded people who were facing similar challenges. Accountability became a game changer for me. I found a mentor who helped guide me through the rough patches and offered invaluable advice on staying consistent. I also set up weekly check-ins with a small group of entrepreneurs who held each other accountable for their goals. When you're accountable to others, it's much harder to procrastinate or give up. I couldn't let my group down, so I pushed myself to stay consistent. If I said I would send 10 emails a day, I had to do it. If I promised to launch a new product by a certain date, I had to follow through. Having that accountability system was like a safety net. On days when I wanted to quit, knowing that someone else was relying on me to keep my promises made it much harder to give in to temptation. Focusing on the process, not just the outcome. One of the biggest mistakes I made early on was focusing too much on the end result. I constantly measured my progress by how much money I was making or how many clients I had. But success is not just about the destination, it's about the journey. As I continued my business journey, I started to shift my focus from the end goal to the process itself. I realized that consistency wasn't about pushing hard for one big win. It was about showing up day after day, even when nothing major was happening. It was about getting better, learning from mistakes, and improving my skills. Instead of stressing over how many sales I had that month, I started focusing on improving my marketing strategy. Instead of beating myself up for not having hundreds of clients, I concentrated on refining my customer service and ensuring that the few clients I had were satisfied. This shift in focus made all the difference. By focusing on the process, I was able to find joy in the small victories, the positive feedback from customers, the new skill I learned, the improvement in my products. I stopped worrying about what I hadn't achieved yet and started appreciating what I was accomplishing. Celebrating small wins. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, constantly chasing the next milestone. But building a business is a long game, and if you don't celebrate the small wins, it can feel like you're never getting anywhere. So, I made it a point to celebrate every milestone, no matter how small. When I reached 100 followers on social media, I celebrated. When I landed my first paid client, I celebrated. When I finished a major project that had been sitting on my to-do list for weeks, I celebrated. Celebrating the small wins gave me a sense of accomplishment and helped keep me motivated. I learned to take pride in each step, no matter how minor it seemed in the grand scheme of things. The key to staying consistent isn't just about working hard every day. It's about finding joy in the process and acknowledging your progress, even when the road ahead still looks long. Building sustainable habits. As time passed, I realized that staying consistent in business wasn't about working harder. It was about working smarter. Instead of burning myself out by doing everything at once, I began to focus on building sustainable habits. I started prioritizing tasks that would have the most long-term impact, rather than chasing every shiny object that came my way. For example, I focused on content marketing, creating valuable blog posts and social media content that would drive traffic to my site. I created an email list and started nurturing relationships with potential clients. I worked on building systems that would allow my business to run smoothly even when I wasn't actively working. By focusing on building good habits and systems, I ensured that I wasn't just staying consistent. I was building a business that could grow sustainably over time. Embracing patience and trusting the process. One of the most difficult things I had to come to terms with was the fact that success doesn't happen overnight. At first, I had expected immediate results. I believed that if I worked hard enough, I'd quickly reap the rewards. But as time went on, I realized that building a business is like planting a seed. It takes time to grow. I started reading more about business success stories and was reminded that many entrepreneurs didn't achieve massive success until years after they started. I had been expecting too much too soon. I began to embrace the process, understanding that each day was an opportunity to build momentum. I started seeing slow growth not as a failure, but as a sign that my efforts were starting to compound. Patience became a crucial part of my mindset. I learned to trust that the work I was doing now, even if it didn't yield immediate results, was setting the stage for bigger things in the future. I let go of the obsession with instant gratification and allowed myself to take a step back. By focusing on the process, I learned that consistency doesn't always bring immediate success, but it builds something much more powerful: momentum. Avoiding burnout. One of the most dangerous traps I almost fell into was burnout. I was determined to succeed, so I worked tirelessly, often sacrificing sleep, leisure, and my personal well-being in the process. But I soon realized that working non-stop wasn't sustainable, and it certainly wasn't healthy. Burnout can be a sneaky enemy, creeping up slowly until you're emotionally and physically drained. I started feeling exhausted even when I wasn't working, and my passion for my business was waning. So I took a step back. I reassessed my priorities and made self-care a non-negotiable part of my routine. I began to set clear boundaries between work and personal time. I learned to listen to my body and mind. If I was tired, I took breaks. If I felt overwhelmed, I asked for help or delegated tasks. Staying consistent didn't mean working myself to the bone. It meant finding a balance that allowed me to keep going for the long haul. The importance of adaptability. As time passed, I realized that my business wasn't going to look exactly how I had imagined it. I had a vision when I started, but the reality of running a business taught me that things rarely go according to plan. I had to remain adaptable to changing circumstances. For example, my original target market didn't respond the way I had hoped, so I had to pivot and refine my strategy. Instead of sticking rigidly to my original plan, I embraced the idea of experimentation. I tested new approaches, tried different marketing channels, and modified my product to better serve my customers. I learned that consistency isn't about following one fixed path. It's about being willing to adapt while still staying committed to your end goal. Adaptability became a core value in my business. I learned that as long as I was consistent in my efforts, I could course correct when necessary. Learning to trust myself. There were times when I doubted myself. I questioned my decisions and second-guessed my ability to build a successful business. But over time, I realized that one of the most important aspects of consistency was trusting myself. I had to trust that the work I was doing would eventually pay off. I had to trust that the effort I was putting into building relationships, refining my product, and marketing my business was all leading towards something bigger. In the beginning, I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure what the future would look like. But I learned to trust the process and trust myself. The more I kept showing up, even in the face of uncertainty, the more I built the confidence to keep going. Self-trust became one of my most valuable assets. It allowed me to push through the tough times and keep working, even when the road ahead wasn't clear. Seeing the results. After a year of consistent effort, I started to see the results of my hard work. I had built a small but loyal customer base. My revenue was steadily increasing, and I had built a system that allowed me to manage my business without burning out. I had learned to trust my instincts, and I knew that I had the tools to keep growing. More importantly, I had developed the habit of showing up, no matter what. I had built a business not based on flashes of inspiration, but on daily, consistent effort. Looking back, I realized that the key to success wasn't any single breakthrough or lucky break. It was the willingness to keep going, day in and day out, even when things weren't easy. I had learned that consistency wasn't just about doing the same thing over and over. It was about growth. It was about progress. It was about trusting that each small action would eventually lead to something bigger than I had imagined. The takeaway: stay consistent, even when you don't see the results. Now, when I look back at where I started, I realize that the most important lesson I've learned is this. Consistency doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require motivation. It doesn't require the perfect plan. What consistency does require is showing up, even when you don't feel like it. It requires patience and adaptability, the willingness to keep going even when the results aren't immediate. Building a business is a marathon, not a sprint. The key is to keep going, step by step, day by day, knowing that the work you put in today will eventually lead to the success you've been striving for. And when that success finally comes, it will feel all the more rewarding because you know you earned it with every single action, every small step you took toward your goal.